And it's welcome back to 2024 and the first episode of We Love Ugly Data. We are not doing what other podcasts have done and secretly recorded one at the end of last year, pretending it was 2024. No, this is legit. Recording this on the 10th of January. It's myself and Alan back. So for those of us joining us for the first time, and for those of us who are coming back, know that actually part of the format of the podcast is to discuss the format of the podcast. Here's the format of the podcast. The format, 3 topics, 30 minutes, roughly about 10 minutes per topic. So, sometimes you get a little bit more, a little bit less, depending how exciting they are. We're kind of at the early part of the year, so we're not necessarily into like the world's busiest news heavy, although there have been a couple of news things that we will cover as we go past, but not the heaviest kind of edition of We Love Ugly Data. But probably more self-referential than some of them. So we get into our first one, Alan. First topic, 2024. Is it a money year? Now, you published a blog post this week, a kind of looking forward to this year. So not our predictions, which is our predictions for the general market, but some specific stuff here. And a lot of them were kind of cash-centric. Do you want to paint a picture for those people who haven't read it? Because everybody will read it, but not everybody's had a chance to read it yet. About what's actually in the post.
Short reading, my goodness me. Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, no, I think this is the year of money again. My God, it's been tough, right? 5 years really? Yeah, 4, 5. Yeah. Depends on how you count, but at least 4. You can sum it up in a few ways, right? Private equity plays an enormous role in our industry these days, right?
Yeah.
And if it's not private equity, then these are big public companies, and which is very different to 15 years ago, 20 years ago, when VCs played a much bigger role. Now, VCs still play a role, and I'll get to that in a second.
And there's big institutional money in both VCs and in private equity, of course.
Exactly. So you've got a number of things going on here. One, private equity have built up big portfolios over the last 15 years, and the nature of private equity is you don't sit on it forever, right? You buy it, you improve it, you grow it, you get a higher valuation on it, and you sell it. That's the whole point of it. And they haven't been able to sell, or they haven't wanted to sell.
And those portfolios have kind of like in 2 forms. There's the kind of large, collection of individual entities under one individual private equity ownership, and then there's the kind of collecting smaller companies and then merging them together under a single branch to make them,
even there sometimes that's. That's a really good point, because let's give 2 examples here: Upland Software and Highland, right? Both private equity. Kofax, another one.
Mm-hmm.
That's the thing. There's the assumption at times that, well, if you have this and you've built this up and you've got a brand, right, that brand will be up for sale. Now, that might be the case. My guess, educated hopefully, this year is that we're going to see some of those brands broken,
right?
Because there'll be some bits of it which are really strong, and there'll be bits of it which are really, really weak, and I think the portfolios will get broken up more than just here's the lot.
So is that the market's changed for them, or have you seen such significant unequal growth inside the entity where it's become kind of misshapen as a result of that unequal growth?
Yeah, it can be, but I think it's also changes in the tech world, changes in the tech market. So if we take Dan's world of IDP, right? Nothing happened for 20 years. That's a slight exaggeration, but not much. And then boom, all this money came in. AI was suddenly discovered, apparently, right? And whatever, anyway, startups coming out left, right, and center, 300 plus, and it's just craziness, right? Craziness. Well, hold on. what about all those people who were around before that craziness? Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's tough. So some of those, I'm not going to name names here, but some of those traditional vendors are having a really tough time, and their private equity owners are like, well, I'm going to have to do something here, right? Because I think we're not putting more money into this. We've already put enough money in, and we're not seeing a good return. So let's offload this somewhere else. So there's that. And then you've also got the VC thing. Certainly not an original thought from me. Other people have said this too, but seed rounds really now are Series A, right. In as much as I want to see profit. I want to see a viable business here, not a PowerPoint deck.
Right. So previously, when they were just looking at a format of growth, and A and B, and often opposed that were purely growth rounds, and those growth rounds were rarely, let's face it, profit. They were turnover, or they were, active use, or other metrics. They weren't necessarily profit. That you're saying that actually profit is coming in earlier.
Much earlier, either actual profit or at least here's a solid business plan and I can promise you it. And by the way, they'll hold you to the promises today, right? Again, it's just, by the way, this isn't about being confidential. It's not right to point fingers, right? Because these are people, these are real people who've got mouths to fill and roofs to keep over their families' heads. But I mean, I know of them whereby, they've made promises to investors, and you know what, in the past, whatever, there would have been more money coming and there would have been a bit of a thing. No, now they're going to lose their job, and the investor's going to put their own CEO in, and it's a much tougher environment.
So basically, the runways are a lot shorter. You've got to hit a takeoff velocity earlier as a startup than you may have done previously. Those Series Ds and E's and F's that became quite common in the previous decade, we don't see that they're going to be an exception rather than something that was part of the plan.
Yeah, but let's not paint too negative a picture here, in the sense that, if you're on the receiving end of all of that life is not fun. The flip side to it is there's a lot of money sitting around waiting to be invested. There is no, I keep saying this to people, there is no shortage of money.
Well, one of the reasons I mentioned it's the 10th of January that we're discussing this is yesterday, even though it's not really part of our area. HPE, so what was part of Hewlett Packard, bought Juniper systems for 14 billion or something like that. So it's a 10x on revenue number. So it's a fairly significant acquisition.
Significant.
And some of that money knocking around is looking for returns better. So the M&A market, is open in that respect.
Absolutely. And some of the big players, you mentioned HPE, they're not what they were, but they're still not an insignificant player. Microsoft, Oracle, etc. Cisco. So Cisco acquired Splunk last year. That was a pretty substantial deal. And no, there's plenty of money. There's plenty of money. It's just it sounds stupid because it's 20 years ago, man. But this is not the .com boom anymore. Those days are long gone. And so I think this is the year of money, but I think it's also the year of focus, right?
Yeah.
You can't just build a system. I was chatting to a little startup just last week, actually, who I've got a lot of time for, a nice bunch. And I just felt like I was repeating what I've been saying to people for the last 2 years. No, I don't care. Your software can do this, and this. We'll figure out the one thing that's going to bring in revenue, right? Yeah. Now, is that something in healthcare? Is that something here? Is it something in governance? I don't care, but figure out the one thing that's actually going to generate revenue, because the days of I can solve the world problem, I'm going to be the next Google, they're gone.
Well, there's an interesting dichotomy, which I think in some senses you don't point to it in your piece, but I think we can probably discuss it briefly, that it's kind of our fault, which is in the broader information management market, you point out that most of it is still greenfield, right?
Yeah.
There might be a lot of startups, but they tend to be very tightly clustered together on a single use case. Now, if you look at Dan's IDP one, there's a perfect example of all of a sudden you've got 300 vendors doing broadly the same thing, and a big chunk of the market away is not being maybe not being addressed. Why I say it's our fault? Well, we've in the past, when people say, "Hey, we have no competition, we're working in a market of one," and we say, "Well, is that really a market?" In the sense that we tend to encourage clusters together because it's easiest for us to describe them, write about them, and talk about their mechanics rather than the differences. So perhaps that's our fault. And by ours, I don't mean you and I mean the broader analyst industry.
I think it is. I think it is. I agree with you. But I think also it comes back to the, we're going to be the next Google. Well, A, no, you're not. But B, there's a belief that I have to sell all of these places to scale a company. No, you don't. And so if we take, my pet is the supply chain, right? But one niche within supply chain can grow you to a $50 million startup, right? I mean, there's plenty of money just in that one tiny niche.
Yeah.
So you don't have to sell everywhere. And I read, I think it was this morning actually, I don't know if it was a transcript or an article, anyway, something about Oracle Cloud is growing at a fast pace. But the bit that caught my attention was Larry Ellison talking about healthcare, and he was saying, this is a specific example he gave. Mm-hmm. He says, he said, in healthcare now, we issue a prescription, the doctor issues you a prescription. They don't know if you ever picked up the prescription. They don't know if you renewed it. They don't know. That has healthcare implications. Now, what Larry's doing, to give him credit, is he's saying, how many of these little niches out there are untapped? Well, what is a prescription? It's a piece of paper. It's automation, right? Yeah. So there's loads of it, and our industry has done a horrible job of looking for those greenfield opportunities, and they all go chasing after accounts payable, accounts receivable. Yeah. And they know what they know, and you hey, by the way, we're here to help you find those if you're one of those people who are looking for new opportunities.
Absolutely. So on from an area which is talking about, hey, it's greenfield, but there's lots of clustering together. We're going to touch on something which, if you've been around our industry for a long time, is very, very much brownfield. And in fact, it's so brownfield, it's constantly been churned up every now and again. It's full of wheel tracks. But we'll come to that in a little bit in a second. This is something, in all the difference, that happened at the end of last year. We recorded our predictions podcast, I think, on the 5th of December. This happened sort of the week after. The nice thing, our point of view, is that it used to be the time, kind of pretty post-Thanksgiving. Nothing very much happened. Oracle used to do a big acquisition, like on the 21st of December, just to keep everybody keen, but not much happened. Now, lots of things happen right up to Christmas, which is kind of interesting. There are still big conferences that happen after Thanksgiving. And one of those was Salesforce basically have a kind of what they call a world tour. So they've basically got a conference that's on the go at various cities all over the world. And they like to have announcements to do at each one, which is nice because there's always something to talk about and write about and of course to brief us about. One specifically that probably passed a lot of people by because it didn't seem enormously exciting, but for us, it kind of reminded us that it's ground that's been churned up previously a lot. Was this One Just Before Christmas, which on the face of it looks a bit arcane and technical, talking about vector databases and, what's that? Unstructured data, semantic search. All of a sudden, people who hadn't necessarily been looking at this area and thinking, well, so it's semantic search back. So what we're seeing here with Salesforce, particularly around AI, is a realization that actually the unstructured data, which is something they never really touched. If you dig into, and this is something that I'm sure Salesforce would push back on, but if you dig into what it is, it's a big database. It's rows and columns and lines, right? Yeah. And it doesn't matter whether it's the sales cloud, which is rows and columns and lines of sales opportunities, or service cloud, which is rows and lines of service tickets. It's the database. And unstructured is kind of the opposite of that. It's uncontrollable. It's the ugly data, which is the kind of the title of our podcast and really the core of our business, the wrangling of it. So seeing the world of database come careering into the world of unstructured data and say, hello, everybody. We can take on all of this now too. Of course, kind of attracted our interest. And the tail end of last year, if you haven't seen it, of course you've seen it. Of course you've read it. Of course you've read it out to your families over Christmas. I wrote a thing about Salesforce now loving ugly data too, and embracing the kind of unstructured, and making that point. Look, this is an organization who very much have been into the rows and columns of databases, and now all of a sudden they want to grab your unstructured data and they want to treat them equally. And it was actually a kind of fascinating perspective, because all of a sudden it's, well, of course, because we become databases, therefore we must understand unstructured data too, because it should be treated in kind of the same way. We'll just put it into a search index. There you go. We'll just go. Why didn't we do this before, Alan? Why didn't we just put the unstructured data into a search index? If it was that simple.
If only it was that simple.
If
Here's the challenge. I think, first of all, I think it's fantastic Salesforce is doing this. And yes, I think it's long overdue, but good for them, right? Mm-hmm. And I think also with the MuleSoft acquisition, because they never really had, I mean, in old-fashioned terms, they never really had workflow, right? They didn't have all of that side of the so I think it's great where Salesforce is going. But it's also indicative of where the market's going, and indeed where deep analysis is going, right? There's just been this preciousness around the file, unstructured data files, that somehow or other that the container is somehow precious, and it has to be stored here and it has to be done that, and it's a different world to structured data.
So hold that thought, because we're definitely going to be coming back to that in a few minutes. Let's just do a little bit more context for people who haven't been following the kind of enterprise generative AI validation story. When I say the story, I mean, it's not even going for a year, which is, in order to use generative AI effectively, Salesforce, Microsoft, Google, so basically the large scale vendors with a significant chunk in the kind of world of productivity suites or desktop applications are saying, hey, in order to use this, you need to use your own, to make it work better, you need to use your own organizational data in order to make the prompts that go off to the LLM to do the magic to give you the AI generated response. To give them more context, you need to give them data. So it's not just the LLMs which are hungry for content, they're hungry for content in a different way. This grounding process, or RAG process as it's also now increasingly being called, is hungry for data, for the context, for the prompt. So it's not just, hey, we've decided that we want to go and look at your old Jive repository, or what you have in Highland or what you have in OpenText, and use that just for the sake of it. No, this is something very specific. This is specifically to help your AI work better. So it's not just the management of data, it's the infusion of knowledge. And they talk very specifically about knowledge sources, not data sources, not repositories, but knowledge. And as we know, knowledge is something which is, the K word has implications in our world of information management, right? It's not just the management of files, and then we'll kind of come back to that in topic 3. But the specific amount is, assuming that there is real knowledge there, the extraction of that knowledge, and then the contextualization of that knowledge in a specific context to the question you want to ask. So it's not just a leap, it's 2 or 3 very big concurrent leaps in one go that you have to make each leap to make this thing work.
Yeah, and this, I know we're going to come to this further, but I just want to stress this. I think it's great Salesforce is doing this. Oracle's sort of doing it with Cerner and all the stuff they're doing. So fully supportive, but this is hard. This is really hard. And for all the announcements, I do wonder, I'm not talking about Salesforce specifically here, I do wonder if they really understand just what they're going to hit head on when they go into a big organization that has a lot of unstructured data that's not being managed very well.
Well, this is a pilot program for them. They're starting it in February. So they're giving themselves January off for a stretch.
They're doing the right thing.
Which is good to take a run up at this, because a run up needs to be taken. And they can, run up and then jump at the beginning of February with selected customers. So this is not something that's a GA product. You would argue it's probably nothing like a product yet. It's more a set of aspirations with some of the tooling, including to actually just wrangle the data and get it.
That's the right approach. I think that is the right approach, because it worries me when people come out and say, "Oh, we've sort of fixed that," and you just think, in a POC, you might get away with it. When you hit the real world, you know, I mean, my Wipro days, right, when you got into the depth of some of these massive companies. Oh yeah. I mean, we call this podcast "Ugly Data." Wow, is it?
Yeah. And as we know, we'll come back to the new 80-20, which we could call the 95-5 rule that we've been talking about offline this week. You know, just that before we even think about the use of this data for the AI prompt engineering stuff, right? Before we get to that, you know, just the looking at big chunks of data, and this isn't just in applications. And applications was one chunk, the other was kind of blob storage, and there's an awful lot of stuff that's been chucked into blob storage as a kind of a way of not really migrating old enterprise data, and it's been dumped there because that's a cheap way of storing data that we're not sure we want to. We don't know if we can delete it or not, because we haven't really got the time to go through it. So we'll put it into some blob storage and hope it's okay. So there's lots of these repositories going around, which are the equivalent of abandoned gold mines. There's probably gold in there, but we have to kind of wait until we've got the technology or the wherewithal to go in there to decide where we want to find them. So there's that whole mining operation, if you like, to go through it and organize them before you get to the actual plumbing in. The plumbing of this is, you know, not simple, but by contrast, much more straightforward. The plumbing this into a process.
But going back to your mining analogy there, it's. I mean, I spent 10 years working in oil and gas, right, before becoming an analyst, and you know, people say, "Oh, the oil's going to run out." Well, aside from whether we should be using oil at all, that's a completely different discussion. But you know, the oil's going up. No, mate. There's loads of oil. The problem is it's in places that it's not worth drilling for it. It costs so much to get it, and that's the same problem here. No doubt there's some gold nuggets in there, but if it's going to cost you $1 million to get hold of one gold nugget, that's a very expensive gold nugget.
There's a very different argument behind exploration and extraction are two entirely separate. Knowing where something is good. Knowing where it is and knowing what the cost is of getting it is another part of the operation. Going and getting it is another operation entirely, right? And I think that's probably something which is much more centric.
Through the coming years is figuring out some of those where it's worth the effort.
So let's bring us on to our third and final topic of the day, which is one which isn't necessarily yet, or I should go, all of the stuff, press releases, articles and stuff, will all be in the show notes. So anything we've talked about, again, as ever, if you're new, there will be some show notes that will come out more or less contemporaneously with this podcast. In fact, you may even have the pod on screen right now. So don't have to worry about writing anything down or trying to, you know, remember headlines or anything. They'll all be with the podcast. So final topic, something that we've been kind of kicking around. Now, normally we start to talk about things to you or talk about things while you listen or make a cup of tea or do the ironing or what else you do, driving, while you do this, listening to this. Normally it's related to something we've published. This isn't something we've actually published yet. This is kind of like an insight into a conversation that we're kind of having right now about some of the things we are going to be publishing this year, which is really about our rethinking. Alan hinted at just now, rethinking about our life of files, because our life is very, very file centric.
Very file centric, and who knows? Maybe we will have this report out by the time the podcast comes out. It'll be soon. We don't know.
But so this just gives a preface to this. Everything that we do is prefaced around information inside files. Files of different sizes and shapes. And the files are really useful if you want to be able to make changes. But we tend to keep things in files forever. You know, a process that ended 10 years ago, we'll still have files available there, which are stored, you know, and that takes up a certain amount of space and it takes up a certain amount of energy to do so. And what we've been thinking about internally is the way in which we store and transfer files long after processes have happened, is that really an appropriate way of handling things anymore? Alan, do you want to go and give us a little bit of what's in our constant toing and froing of getting a research paper out?
It's been a lot of to and fro, and I think though it's been valuable because Gartner, what was it, 5 years ago, said ECM is dead, and whoa, hoo-ha about that. And then I think it was Holly at Forrester published something last year basically saying exactly the same thing. ECM is dead. She had a slightly different take on it, to be fair to her, but whatever. And everybody took issue at it, and probably I did too. But here's the thing: ECM doesn't work. It's never worked. We all know. Actually, it's not strictly true. When document management first came along, they did actually work because that was that transition point from paper. Not that everybody's actually made the transition, but in theory, at least, right? This was the transition point to digital. So you actually had people in your office who knew how to file and actually knew how to do things, right? So they were, so I'm doing it on a screen now instead of doing it now, right? Well, somehow or other, we managed to lose those people, and we just started filling up these containers. And the reality is it hasn't worked for a long time. And it's very frustrating because on the one hand, there's this market, there's this industry, there's this. Well, what we're trying to do, and I think we're making good progress on it. And I think when we publish this paper, there'll be people out there saying, what a load of crap, you're completely wrong.
Well, of course they will.
But I think we're doing a service here, because basically what we're trying to do is sit back and go, well, actually, what is the problem? What is the problem? Let's forget about ECM for a second. What is the problem? And the problem is that now I don't actually believe this number. I'll be the first to say it. Okay, I just don't. But according to Forrester, 90% of data is unstructured. But let's say it's true, because it's definitely a very high number. Okay.
And we can do a call back to the previous podcast, and I'll put the link in there when Dan and I discuss that specific statistic.
And it's a really interesting one. But but aside from whether it's spot on or not, no doubt, right? No doubt, a very, very large majority of data. Well, here's the thing. This is where the problem comes, because I just did that on purpose. 90% of the data is unstructured. No, let's take a step back here. 90% of the storage volume is unstructured files. Mm-hmm. How much of that is actually truly actionable business value data?
Yeah, this is
tiny percentage.
It's our Christmas box of chocolates. How much of it is chocolates, and how much of it is wrapping to move the chocolates around in a safe file? And that's our 95.5 sum that I mentioned earlier on.
And I think
5% of the enterprise data is wrapped up in 95 of the packaging, and that packaging is all the proprietary or non-proprietary file formats that we use to service them.
And this is where it gets interesting, because if we just take at face value the 90% unstructured figure, okay, so 10% is structured data. Well, okay, let's be generous here and say 10% of the unstructured data is actual proper business data, right? This is the number of an invoice. This is somebody's address. This is the words in a contract, whatever. Okay, so now that's the same amount as is in structured data. So that's 20% now. The remaining 80% is just packaging, containers. Yep. And it's this number, this 80%, 90% is unstructured, has been fueling our industry for years. And it's just totally misleading, right? So again, supply chain, world I love, been in the back of some of these containers on the slide that we've got here on this thing, right? And you've got refrigerated container, and you've got all of these kind of things, right? Yeah, it's just a container.
Yep.
What's the value is the goods inside it. And if there's no goods inside it, you know what? It's a couple of grand.
Well, I'd argue they would do it. I'll argue this too. I mean, Donald McLean gets all the credit for the intermodal container, but actually all the real credit goes to the engineer, a guy called Keith Tantlinger, who invented not necessarily the container itself, but the twist lock mechanism that allows them to snap together, and then persuaded McLean to ISO standard it so anyone can use it. So it was the intermodality of the container, the interoperability of the container that meant anybody could open it and close it, and everybody could produce ones of the same standard and clump them together into a big pile. That actually made them successful.
Incredibly successful and transformative. And mangling your analogy or simile here a little bit, but hats off to Adobe in the PDF format, right? I mean, so that's it. But again, in supply chain, the container, it's just there to contain something of value. When nothing is inside the container, it's scrap metal.
So to paraphrase a movie, and last time I ended up talking about Citizen Kane in an unplanned way. I'm now going to talk about Forrest Gump in an unplanned way. The enterprise life is a lot like a box of chocolates. 95% of it is trash.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we're just posing this here, but if you come to it, I mean, I guess it is a bit conceptual and philosophical, and whatever big words we want to use here. But if we look at what the problem is we're spending the vast amount of our storage costs on containers that are of no value.
Yep.
And we're in a world where structured data, whether we like it or not, that's the good stuff, right? Mm-hmm. That's good stuff that AI wants to eat up, right? Now, we're not saying you just stick everything into rows and columns in a database. We're not saying that the container doesn't have some value. But our industry needs to really have a complete rethink about its value, its structure, its processes, its methodologies. Records managers need to have a real wake-up call and realize this is about data and the life cycle about data. We can't fix it all, but we can maybe pose the right questions, I would like to think. Video, we've been talking with various companies this past year about enterprise video, right? And lots of problems with enterprise video. But again, I mean, there's a perfect example of which, again, I don't have the answers, but you can record a meeting just as we're doing with this podcast.
Yep.
But you can record a meeting, and I think it's a great thing. And now you have AI, which can generate a transcript and say who said what and summarize. Yep. Fantastic. How big is that video file? It's huge. Mm-hmm. How much actionable data is in it? Well, not much. Do I need to keep the entire video file forever? No. So who's designing systems to help clear this junk out?
Yes.
And at the moment, the answer is nobody. And if you're a storage vendor, well, I don't want to get rid of it. I want you to fill up more boxes, please, and I'll charge you more next month. But as an industry, this is our challenge.
I think if you look at those vendors we talk about as being the hyperscalers, so the people with the very big investments in cloud storage, they're also the same people with the very big investments in business applications, which generate. Yep. So they've got a need to not necessarily decrease, but to rationalize the growth of that data, not just for reasons of physical storage, but also more maybe the larger pressing ones, like the amount of heat which is generated, the amount of energy that's required in doing that, to make sure that we're recording information in as fewer places as possible, because duplication, we haven't really talked about, it's a huge underlying, and your idea of a meeting with a video and a transcript and a summary, all that contain the same pieces of information, is a perfect example of a triplication of data. Before someone makes a local copy, and then the second person makes a local copy, and the third person makes a local copy. So there's lots of ways in which that exponentially increases very easily inside the enterprise.
Yeah, and basically the files we talk about the most are things like PDFs, right? Word documents, whatever, but let's stick with PDFs. I'm a big fan of a PDF. We use it all the time, right? But it's a human-centric file. Right,
it's a print-centric file.
Yeah, but more and more files never have a human involvement.
Yeah,
or very little, right? And my outside of work, my big love is the world of art and photography, and it's consumed me for decades. And the world of photography is going through this too, right? What is the photograph? Is it the print? Is it something you saw on Instagram, right? I mean, so this is a bigger discussion going on in the world, but my goodness me, it's about time we started having it, because there's huge opportunities here, to, not just to make money, but to do some good and sort some junk out.
Well, on that bombshell, next
On
time,
that bombshell.
3 more topics, 30 minutes to discuss them. Alan, thank you again for contributing. Hopefully, you're already clicking on those show notes and reading those pieces of research and booking time on our calendars to have discussions with us, and we'll look forward to having those. But until then, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.